Hello, everybody. We are here. My name is Marcelo Carreño, and then I'm from QC Certification. We are a certification body here in Brazil, and then we are here in the medical fair in Brazil to have a talk with my guests here. We are going to talk on what the foreign manufacturers can expect about the Brazilian market. To start our talk today, I am going to ask for them to have introduced themselves. And then Mikey, can you talk about a little more about your experience, about you?
Yeah, thank you, Marcelo. Thank you for the invitation today that we can talk about, I think, a very important topic especially for the foreigners. And yeah, I'm also glad that I can share my experiences here, also experience with Bertrand, who has another angle than me. My name is Mike Endler. I am director of the consulting company here. It's called Sobel, and we are focused on everything what is necessary in the regulatory field to bring your devices on the market. But we are not focusing only on the regulatory part. We are also including, for example, very important topics like the biological and the clinical parts, and also what many forget, you find a lot of specialists in each area, but you don't understand that they don't often understand everyone together. So we really try to build a strong consulting company that helps to understand all of the issues that are needed and bring them together. And whatever the question is of the manufacturer, we can probably solve that.
Good.
Thank you.
Bertrand, can you introduce?
Okay, so thanks a lot again, Marcel, for the invitation. So again, saying that this topic is very important for us too. We are importers and distributors of medical equipment. So this question of what's important for what to expect from the Brazilian market in Brazil is really important for foreign manufacturers. Brazil is the medical health sector in Brazil is a very large sector. It's very important. However, it has a lot of specificities. It's not easy somehow to address. We will discuss it later, I think, in details. And that's why a fair like this is really important to make contacts, understand who are the players, like QC Cert, who's a very important element in the introduction of foreign health products to Brazil. So I think it's quite important to give a lot of information to foreign manufacturers as to what to expect when they want to give a look at the Brazilian market.
Good, Bertrand. Thank you for both ones. It's a good question. We aim to support a little bit the foreign manufacturers, how we can support them with some suggestions, with some points, some point of view. And then you're not from Brazil, yeah? Mike is from Germany.
50% Brazilian already.
For sure. And Bertrand is from France. And though they can put their view, their experience, how to live here in Brazil, and all about the manufacturer inside the Havacom. So we know that we have the good part of our products used in the health today, in the hospital, for example, they come abroad, yeah. And now, what in your view? What do you think that why the Brazilian market is attractive for them, those manufacturers, for example? Why they would like to sell in Brazil? You can start.
Of course, it's if you look solely on the numbers, Brazil at the moment is in the medical device sector, I think it's number 5 or 6 or something in the world. But of course, only if you look at these numbers, it's definitely an interesting market. But you need to look very carefully because it depends really on the product types that you are aiming to bring on the market. Because you need to consider, for example, a lot of things. For example, there are usually products produced here in Brazil that are usually lower technology that is used for the national market, and usually the more high-priced products that are not produced in Brazil that are imported, and that is still the biggest portion. This is something what you really need to consider in the beginning to think, where is my product? Is it a more, let's say, a simple technology product and I need to compete with the products on the market that are produced in Brazil? And probably Bertrand will talk about this more, but if you look if you bring, let's say, a low price product on the market into Brazil, then you have a lot of issues like taxes and importation issues and so on. This is something what you really need to consider carefully, but it's from the regulatory perspective, it's usually a bit more easy, especially when you come from the markets that you already know, for example, European or US market. Let's say every high regulated market in the world makes it easier to come to Brazil. So usually there are not so many additional, let's say, requirements you need to fulfill. But of course, you don't need to forget them depending on what the type of product you need additional certifications.
Bertrand, in your view, what is becomes the Brazilian market attractive for the foreign manufacturers?
Okay, first of all, I think we can talk about the size of the Brazilian market. Brazil is one of the top 10 economies in the world. The health market in Brazil is also one of the largest one. So inevitably, any company which is whether it is a multinational company or a smaller company with a specific technology, must look at Brazil if they really want to expand worldwide and really have a presence on the major markets in the world. So initially, I would say basically the size of Brazil is already an attractive in itself. Second, you have a market which is quite open to innovation in the first place. Then we can discuss the difficulties, but still it's very open to innovation. And we see that Brazilian professionals, surgeons, doctors and everything, they travel a lot. They are really connected to all the international fairs, all the new technology in the world. So they are quite willing to bring that to Brazil and test that to Brazil. So the market is quite open. Brazil is looking at what's being done worldwide. What are the best practices? What's the best equipment in the world? So therefore, it's very interesting for manufacturers to try and sell in Brazil. Again, Brazil being a large country, I would tend to say that there is always an opportunity somewhere. Sometimes you have smaller countries, you have one capital city, and once you've exhausted this one place, you don't have many places where to go for opportunities. In Brazil, with 5 large regions, which correspond to the organization of the market, basically, you can really develop a commercial strategy where you can have a different type of strategies depending on the level of market you want to reach. So I would say somehow it's difficult not to have any opportunity in Brazil. The market is large. You have a great segmentation for the market. So if you give yourself the resources to succeed in Brazil, it's highly likely that you will find some partners and you will find a place in the market. Brazil also has what is considered the largest public health sector in the world. SUS is considered the largest one because other countries which are larger than Brazil don't have such a strong public sector for health. So this means that between the private sector and public sector, you can have a lot of opportunities in Brazil. And this is probably what makes Brazil quite attractive.
Yeah, really good. But now, if you are thinking with the mind, the companies abroad, yeah, you are thinking that the European company, for example, what they are looking for here in Brazil, what they thinking to start to sell here, for example, what could make? Oh, I'm looking for. I don't know. I would like you can share your experience with your contact with the companies abroad, for example.
Of course, it really depends on the business plan of the company. Yeah? So if I think about some examples why companies are coming to Brazil, of course let's say Brazil usually is not the first country where they want to sell their products. Very frankly speaking, it's very rare the case that they are having, for example, a product already registered, for example, and then want to sell it directly to Brazil. No, that's not the case. It's very rare. But the companies that deciding for the Brazilian market, of course, we talk about this, is sheer the volume. If they have, for example, already registered in various markets, they decide, okay, include Brazil in my portfolio. They have a certain maturity already. That is important because Brazil is not, let's say, not in regards only for the regulatory side, but also what already told us. It's a very complex economic structure And usually, let's say a small startup company is usually not mature enough to understand all these and have sufficient experience to bring their products on these markets, because everyone knows this. We will talk about this a bit more. It's very complex. There are a lot of things to consider, and usually only companies with more experience usually succeed in this country. Yeah.
Bertrand, in your view,
So I wouldn't speak in terms of sectors because I think, we are here at one of the largest medical fairs in Brazil, so we can see all kind of products from consumable to equipment. I think the Brazilian market reflects the world market for medical product and health equipment. Basically, you have large multinational companies, but also smaller companies with innovative products. In terms of opportunities, our company was established 7 years ago. Our idea, and it's in the name, Medinova Life Sciences, our idea was to introduce innovation into the Brazilian market. Again, the Brazilian market, the health sector, is really open to innovations. The health sector is really dynamic in this sense. You always have new techniques, equipment, products to offer on the market, which allow to improve the quality of the treatments or the efficiency of those treatments. So I'd say again, innovations that are emerging outside of Brazil are welcome here. We can see the interest from Brazilian companies to bring those innovations to Brazil. Again, there's one big step, which is a regulatory part, which must be addressed, because you don't enter Brazil maybe as fast or as easily as the other countries. But in terms of sectors, I wouldn't say there's Brazil reflects what the world is asking in terms of health products and equipment.
good. But as Mike said, if the companies abroad put in their plan, oh, I will go to Brazil, yeah, I will establish my company in Brazil now, or to make one partnership in Brazil. In your opinion, what precautions those manufacturers should take when they come to Brazil? Important questions, yeah.
it's complicated because I was just thinking about
I don't know if they put the plan, the precautions.
I know. It's more when I think back in the last years. So of course I opened also a few companies, and it's really difficult to say where to start because everyone was a different challenge. Let's say that, and different topics. But let's say just pick a few. Of course, the first thing is what you need to think is, does it make sense? Does it make sense to open a subsidiary here in Brazil, or maybe more, maybe a South American headquarter or something? Right. Yeah, some also do this if they want to expand further in the Latin American markets. That definitely this is the first consideration, and because it triggers a lot of things. Because, for example, sometimes it is easier to say I have a good partner here in the market because of the volume. It's maybe not enough to really, let's say, incorporate all the costs involved, and usually this is something what is difficult really to calculate in the beginning. It's not just to say I don't know, take $10,000 or something, open your company, everything is included. No, there are a lot of surprises not included in it. This is the first thing. But if you decide, for example, because of tax reasons, this is often the case that you say I complete the production or do a big portion of the production, for example, in Brazil, then it's definitely much cheaper to sell this in the market. But, for example, another strategy could be, often this is the case, for example, for big companies who consider Brazil as let's say, as a cheaper alternative for manufacturing, for example. Yeah. This is sometimes, more and more often it's the case, because we are also doing this in some kind. It's because the idea is we have very good qualified people here in Brazil. You have good universities that are required. Of course, sometimes the language is a bit an issue, finding people who speak fluent English, for example, but you find them. And this is often more and more an attractive strategy to say we operate here in Brazil, but not for the Brazilian market. Of course, we take it as an asset, as a plus to do this, but we also produce products here for the international market, for some markets, for example, for the US American market, for example, European market sometimes, depending on the product. And this makes Brazil very attractive at this point because, let's say, the price level is much cheaper than, for example, with these high price markets. Often we are talking about, for example, with testing. This is a good example. It's a good example.
Yeah.
We have sometimes cost reduction by 90% because the go to laboratories in Europe, you pay, let's say, 10,000, you pay 1,000, for example. That is often
In the delivery time is a good
delivery
question,
time is another point. Yes. So it really depends. Yeah. So that's the reason why it's not easy to answer. But these are some aspects they consider.
Hey Bertrand, in your mind, if one manufacturer abroad would like to have a good partnership here, what precautions they should have?
Okay, so well, I think it's a large question, and I don't know if
You
we'll have
said to
time
me,
today.
you must have good partners in Brazil, but what are precautions that you have?
So yeah, for the partner, also for the market, also more generally speaking. Obviously, Brazil, as we said earlier, is an interesting market. It's an attractive market. However, you have to take a lot of precautions. First, because depending on the product you have, it may take some time to get into Brazil. So I think this is really something to take into consideration. We know that ANVIS has 4 classes of, for equipment, 4 classes of registration. There are 18 rules. So in some cases, you can register a product very fast with ANVIS. In 30 days, you can have your product ready for sale on the market. For the products, it can be a project of 1 year, 1 to 2 years. If you have the registration plus some certification, like the INMETRO certification, or increasingly Anatel certification when you have a radio frequency, the equipment working with radio frequency. So this is the first precaution that sometimes manufacturers abroad don't plan. They say, okay, I'm interested in Brazil, I'm going to Brazil now. It is not exactly like that, and you really have to plan what's your schedule, what's your timetable, before you can really start offering your products to Brazil. And this includes, for instance, participation to a trade fair, because sometimes we see companies outside who say, okay, I'm going to participate, take part in a trade fair in 2 months' time, 3 months' time. I want to be ready. The regulatory part, the product won't necessarily be available for commercialization in Brazil within 2 or 3 months. So this is a very good first precaution to take. What's the regulatory path before getting into Brazil? Second, because in Brazil taxes are a fact of life, you will have to see if your product is sellable in Brazil. Obviously, that will depend a lot on competition. Taxes are normally, I would say, the same for everybody. If they're not the same, it's because some companies, local can have an advantage versus an imported product, or depending on where you set up your operation, you can have a fiscal advantage. So this is really important to check also and to put it at the beginning of your reflection, and not once you register everything, you realize that your product cannot be sold in Brazil because it will be too costly. Because you have like in any country, you have many tax brackets. You have a lot of, but you have some products which are protected because this is a factor that is well known by at the WTO or at the World Bank. Brazil is quite a closed country. It's importing a lot. So foreign trade of Brazil is increasing a lot, but still, it's not easy to import, and local products tend to have kind of an advantage versus imported products. Obviously, there are plenty of exonerations to that. The Ministry of Economics, the customs, Brazilian customs offer tax breaks for products which are not available in Brazil, which are not manufactured here. So the logic is, if the product is not available here, under some circumstances, you can have a tax rebate on that. So, which means you can import a product with in a quite competitive manner. So this is a big part of the precaution you have to take first, what's the schedule, what's the timetable, how long will it take to bring to Brazil?
How long did you take your company to establish your company here?
So there is a product and there is a company.
Yeah,
so this is a very
exactly.
long discussion, but you can bring your products through a partnership with an importer. But if you want to set up shop, and some companies sometimes decide to start a subsidiary immediately, then you are faced with the challenge, I will say, the challenge of doing business in Brazil. The World Bank was doing an annual ranking of countries with how to do business. I think the name was how to do business. And ranking all the countries in the world. Brazil, which is one of the top 10 economies, was always behind the 120th rank in the world. So doing business in Brazil is not easy. And since it's a federal state, a federal country like the US and a few other countries, every state in Brazil, we have 26 states plus the federal district, every state in Brazil has its own autonomy to implement legislation on how to do business, which means you really have to study where you want to set up your operation, because you can have a big advantage or disadvantage depending on where you set up your operation. For instance, at the moment, in general, the state of Santa Catarina, for instance, is a very competitive state to start an import operation and distribution in Brazil. So this also is very important. And what you are referring to, I think, is a regulatory part. There is also the legislation in Brazil, which is valid for all countries. However, and it is a fact of life, the Brazilian legislation is not implementing exactly in the same way in one place and in another place. Same legislation, different application. And this is a reality that companies are having to face. It may be longer to set up a company in one place of the country instead of another place. So it's really, really important, as everywhere, to have good partners. But really, when you are developing a project in Brazil, whether for registering a product or for setting up an importing company, if you want to set up your own subsidiary, to work with people who already have the experience, who have literally had the experience, who have had the experience of doing what you want to do, where you want to do. Because it's not really a good idea to start and discover while you are advancing, because you could lose a lot of time in your project, facing difficulties that you didn't plan, because you didn't know how the local authorities would react to your project or something like that. So it's really important to plan. I mean, obviously all the modalities of the project, but since you have some states in Brazil which are known to be more business friendly than others, who are more accustomed also to having more businesses than others. So implementing one operation in one place will be much easier than in the other one. And this is very important to know where you're going, to avoid delays, because you don't have the full support from the local authorities that don't know your business, for instance. So it's really important to know exactly where you're going, and to know that you will have the institutional background that will be supportive to your business.
Good. Yeah, I have a talk with some manufacturers. I have a contact with them all days, and then I don't know if you have the same view. They have one hard difficulty here is the language. Yeah, because the language is just Portuguese here. Yeah, and the qualified person. Yeah. Did you have the same impression? Did you have the same?
Yeah, because let's say you find everything in Brazil, but you need to look for it very, very closely, because it's sometimes not easy to find. Because what Bertrand said is it's the decision where you open your company is also related not only to the, let's say, tax authorities or local authorities regarding your operational licenses, but it's also exactly this one: find the right people qualified for your business. For example, in my case, we are talking always about graduated people, usually at least a certain level of English. And for example, this is something it's difficult to find usually in the rural areas, in let's say in a back countryside, it's more difficult. You find them, but it's
You can find them you need to looking
Yes.
for that.
Yes. So that's the reason why you're usually focusing more on let's say bigger cities where you find more qualified people. But let's say the pandemic changed also a bit this issue because more and more people are going back in the countryside and like cities like where you come from, not the big cities of São Paulo or Rio or Porto Alegre. It makes it easier to find qualified people, but it's something what you really need to consider in your business plan before you open this. Maybe it's easy to open it, but maybe you don't find the people for your operations. Or the quantity is sometimes also an issue because sometimes you need lower qualified people, you will not find the quantity there. So but as I said, it depends on your type of business.
What about your opinion, Kamash?
Well, language obviously, I wouldn't say it's more communication than the language, which is maybe a little difficulty. We have in the, let's say, people inserted in this international market, they tend to speak English. We have the foreign companies which tend to speak English. However, when you have two foreigners speaking English, sometimes there is a bit of a mix-up in the communication because between the emission and the reception, and this is sometimes what we see as a difficulty because people communicate. However, the message sometimes is a difficulty to get through. Some difficulty to get through, particularly because coming back to one subject we discussed earlier, the legislation of Brazil is really detailed rules. From our experience, we talk to companies which have a general understanding of what is required to enter Brazil, but very general. And rightly so, when we start entering into the details, sometimes they don't really understand exactly what are all the requirements for them to get into Brazil. And that's why sometimes it's a bit difficult. Foreign companies sometimes tend to think that the local authorities are difficult or not collaborating. Actually, what we see in our experience, sometimes they didn't understand very well what was required, and therefore they didn't present all the documents or everything that was requested for registration in the proper manner. Being French, I tend to work with a lot of French companies. We're also working with different commercial agencies from different embassies, from France, the UK, Spain, everything. And we have a lot of detailed discussions because what we see is that companies don't, in the first moment, they don't apprehend really well exactly all that is necessary to get into Brazil. And so that's why we spend a lot of time explaining Brazil so that they understand very well what will be required and how they can get into Brazil successfully. Sometimes we even have good surprises because one good thing, and that maybe we'll detail later, but in my experience, we can see that all the legislation from Brazil has been improving over the last 5, 6, 7 years. I would say since 2014, 15, 16, we've seen the legislation from Anvisa basically, but also in Metro more recently, going in a manner that is making things more logical and easier for everyone to work. We cannot deny that in the past some legislation that was put into place that was maybe a bit too extreme and they were of very difficult implementation. But however, now we are seeing that Anvisa and Inmetro are putting in place legislation that are basically aligning with what is being done in other countries. So this is companies which have been following Brazil for a long time, and sometimes that have been waiting because no, I'm interested in Brazil, but it's a bit too difficult for me at this time. I'm not ready yet. Are discovering that now, yes, they can come to Brazil because with what they have in place outside in their original market, they have 90% or 99% of what they need to get into Brazil. And we had a very nice case last year. I was talking to a company which was in the medical software business. They told me, okay, we know Brazil, we've been following Brazil. I know it will take about 2 years, but I want to start now. I say, okay, what's your product? What are you doing? Okay. Say, well, you're gonna have a good surprise because now your product can be registered in 30 days. Say, what? So the company was really expecting 2 years because they had an information that was old. They had been looking at Brazil a long time ago, but now the legislation has been simplified. For instance, you used to have 4 classes of registration with Anvisa, but you had 2 registration, Cadastro y Registro. Cadastro was simplified from notification, so you had class 1 which went to notification, now class 2 also is notification. So because Anvisa realized that they were spending 40% of their time looking in detail at products that were with very low risk. So I said, okay, let's be pragmatical, let's spend our time and our resources being maybe more cautious with what is of higher risk, and what is of lower risk, which is already sold everywhere in the world, will make it easier to go. And we can see it from our daily operation, from what we're importing or the product we are bringing, but also for the regulatory services we are providing to companies. In general, companies tend to have a good surprise because, again, over the last 4-6 years, it's been really improving. And we've seen also with the pandemic, Anvisa and Inmetro have been implementing measures that were really exceptional. They were obviously exceptional in terms of measures and also for the validity of when they lasted. But during there were some windows of opportunity for 1 year, 2 years, where, for instance, all products related to COVID, to the fight against COVID-19, were of very simplified registration import. So I think this is a very positive factor for Brazil and for a company willing to go into Brazil and pursue opportunities in Brazil. I would say the access is getting better, easier, and easier to deal with. So this is a very important information to know for foreign companies willing to enter into the Brazilian market, I would say.
Good. But we started talking about one important item, because the regulation. Yeah. We know that Brazil, we have a regulation, we have a Visa regulation, we have a Inmetro regulation. If you insert some telecom device in your equipment, for example, you must have Anatel homologation too. Yeah. But we know that in Europe you have their directives, that for example for medical device. So, could you highlight some similarities between those regulations in Brazil or in Europe or US, for example? Could you highlight some similarities?
I think what I mentioned before in the beginning, what was similarities, what is, I think, helps every company, foreign companies usually from Europe, is very much similarities in the accreditation structure. So of course we are dealing with notified bodies there in Europe. It's not exactly the same structure as Brazil, but if you look, for example, for the requirements that are needed to, for example, to certify a product, let's look at the Inmetro part, for example, then you see already that the accreditation structure behind that, it's very similar. We have often many standards which are the same. Notified bodies accepting in Europe, for example, certification, for any test reports, for example, from the Brazilian market, because the standards, the underlying standards in many cases are the same. So that's, from this perspective, it makes it very attractive. For example, what else? What I also see is in the last years, what Bertrand mentioned, is the part that Anvisa is also looking to the European market and tries to get closer as it was in the past. Because if you look, for example, the risk classifications were many years the same based on the European rules. Of course, because of the MDR transition, now we have a gap. But we see really that Anvisa, when you look at the agenda from Anvisa, also that we are step by step they're getting closer back to the European requirements. I assume they will not get really on par. They will really not copy the European system. I think it wouldn't be I wouldn't say very effective for the Brazilian market, because in many cases the Brazilian the national companies already struggling with some requirements here. And if you set, let's say, a lot of regulations on top, I think it would be too much for the market, at least for the next years. So, but as I said, if you see this path of Anvisa and together, for example, with the accreditation structure, it makes it very similar and, let's say, attractive for both sides, for both markets at this point. But of course, there are a lot of
Similarity, yeah.
similarity, but also in detail there are differences, of course.
Especially the standard could be the same, yeah. So for
Yes.
INMETRO, for example, you can accept the test report
Yes.
performed by the accredited lab outside, for example.
That's, for example, what I said, because that's the reason sometimes companies from these high regulated markets now discover Brazil for, let's say, for these type of business to say, let's do it here because it's much cheaper, and then it's accepted in US, for example, or in the European markets or other markets, for example.
But Bertrand, when you have a contact with the manufacturer in Europe, for example, do you believe that the European manufacturer is ready to come to here? If you are talking about the regulation part?
Yeah, in terms of regulation, we can see there is a great convergence of sanitary legislation between countries. Again, talking about the simplification and harmonization which is happening in Brazil, we see that Brazil is part of the MDSAP initiative, for instance, where there is a dialogue between regulatory authorities from different countries, which is making it easier and faster for foreign manufacturers which have already a MDSAP certification to enter into Brazil. So in terms of, I can see to answer shortly your question, yes, I can see that foreign manufacturers, generally speaking, are already ready because they obviously are attending their local legislation and being able to export from their own country. They already are I would say, fit to export to Brazil. And it's really important to see if we can say the best companies or the companies with the best practices even have an incentive when they are coming to Brazil, because their coming into Brazil will be made easier. Seeing companies that are inserted in the MDSAP certification, companies which have ISO 13485, companies which have a number of different certification, already have everything that normally Anvisa and INMETRO are requiring. Companies which are doing testing of their equipment, for instance. Sometimes one element which is delaying the entry into the Brazilian market is that foreign manufacturers have to do some additional testing for their products to comply with the Brazilian legislation from INMETRO. Companies which already do that in their own market, which are really well organized, do a certification of their product, they already have everything which is required to enter Brazil. We see one company which we are bringing to Brazil now. The INMETRO certification will be done very fast because they already have all the tests being done. So the INMETRO certification part can be done in 2-3 months' time, which is really fast. And the product registration with Anvisa can be done in that case in 60 days. So it means in 4 months,
Oh, really?
the product can be already registered. We've seen in the past products that we've been registering for Brazil, the company didn't have the testing for the products, and it took them a lot of time in their own market of origin to do the testing with their own certification companies or laboratory or the testing.
Testing.
So what we can see is that the best companies outside can do the registration in Brazil very easily. If they are not really well prepared in their own country, it will not be easier for them to come here. Brazil is not an easy country to access. But really, we can see that the company which have the best practices outside can easily enter because they have everything which is requested to enter Brazil. And it's also kind of an incentive for them to have the best practices outside. Because we can see when you have to register products like medical equipment, which require a certification of good manufacturing practices, the GMP certification in Brazil can be the longest part of the market access to Brazil. If the company already has a certification outside, and if they have, for instance, MDSAP certification, this can greatly reduce the time of certification for Brazil. And this is so. Therefore, it's really important for the company to be very well prepared outside, because on the other hand, we can see companies which are a bit already discovering their own quality management system, which are a bit not let's say 100% in their practices outside, will face some difficulties because they will get some questioning from the regulatory authorities in Brazil, and this will delay the certification for Brazil. So I would say Brazil is not for amateurs, it's really for companies which are really well prepared and really willing to do their homework very well to have a straightforward access to the Brazilian market.
We had a good experience with the manufacturers in Europe, for example, especially for Inmetro certification, because it's our case, yeah. Because the standards is the same that we asked, we are going to request here in Brazil is the same. We can accept the test report performed abroad, for example, in an accredited laboratory, performed in any country in Europe. And then the documentation is good. And then in special for Inmetro, we can accept, for example, the test report in English. You don't need to make a translation for Portuguese, for example. I know for Anvisa, they must to make a translation for some documentation, but for us, if they're gonna send to us the risk assessment, the usability, the safety report, the EMC report, we can accept it in English. That's the perfect, yeah. And then also for factory audit, the standard is the same, yeah. We use here, everyone uses the standard for quality system for medical device in Europe. It's easy, yeah.
For Anvisa also, you mentioned Inmetro, but for Anvisa also, companies can use all kinds of documents that may have in English and Spanish, in addition to Portuguese.
They can use it in English too?
For the registration. Obviously, for the final part, they have to present the instruction for use in the local language. So eventually they will have that, because obviously if you want to talk to your customer, you'd better talk to your customer in its own language, because otherwise it will make it difficult. But for a lot of documents required for technical registration, you can use all those documents in English or Spanish, depending on the company.
What documentation you must to translate for Portuguese?
Instruction for use. Instruction for use must be.
But is it the same for us? Yeah. And then you use for us and then for
labeling as well.
Is it good? Huh?
Yeah. It makes it easier. Yeah.
But the risk assessment they accept in English.
Yes, there are a lot of technical documents are used by Anvisa in English. Or Spanish. But
good.
A lot of companies have English documentation.
Okay, but if you are going to set for those manufacturers one good suggestion for them, what they would like to say, for example, I don't know, is it your mind?
Yeah, I can start because I have an idea. I think the best advice you can give, which is a free advice and it's not necessarily easy to implement, but the big advice is choose very well your partners. Because if you don't choose a good partner, and we see that the access to Brazil is you have the regulatory part, you have the logistical part, and you have let's say one which is the customs part, which is also involved. But if you have the good partners, people who know what they're talking about and know how to really help you, which are professionals, you won't have major difficulties to get into Brazil. And we know that some companies say, I've looked at Brazil, it's difficult, we never know what's going to happen and everything. I think we must say, unfortunately, that in a number of cases, it's because they didn't have the proper partners. But now if you have a partner which can really identify which is your product and what will be the best regulatory strategy. If you have a good partner for Inmetro certification, technical partner like KCCert, which we can say, I don't know.
Thank you.
We've been working together for a while, so we know that it works. But this is it. It's a team. It's like a football team. You have to have the best player in each position on the field, on the pitch. But this is it. Because therefore, if you don't have the right partners, they will blame the authorities. Customs didn't do that, and Anvisa didn't do that, and in Metro didn't do that. Then, this unfortunately happens. But if you really set up a team and it's not easy to know beforehand if you have the right partner. But if you engage with them, if you have a lot of discussions, you can have a feeling of what they've been doing, what kind of products they've been registering. You can ask for references, and then you can form an opinion if you're going with the right person or not. It's not the best idea necessarily to go to the cheapest. It's not necessarily the best idea to go to the most expensive, because the price won't necessarily be won't be the only indication of the good partners that you have. But really, doing business in Brazil is really a team sport, I would say. You really need a team, because it's for most countries it's a faraway market. I mean, we're in a corner of the world. Brazil is quite far away from everybody. So it's not easy to get access to Brazil. You must ship by air freight, you must do maritime transport. When you send your equipment, your material, it will travel a lot. So you have to plan everything, and to have a certain reassurance that you won't have many problems on the way, you have to plan and try and identify good partners, people you are comfortable dealing with, so that your entry into the Brazilian market will be easier.
Good. And Mark, if someone called to you from Germany or any country in Europe, hey Mark, can you say something good from Brazilian market to me today?
Yes, of course. There are a lot of good things. We talked about a lot of good positive aspects about Brazil. But if you would ask me also the same, but what Bertrand said is true. The only thing what I would add is, if you're looking for the partner, then look for a partner who is really not for a solely Brazilian partner, because usually they have the issues, they don't understand countries' requirements out of Brazil. Usually it helps at least to have people inside this partnering companies who have national, international experience, or the composition is maybe from, for example, France, or in this case, Germany, or whatever the country is, but at least to have international experience, so that they can really bridge not only the Brazilian culture, but also the culture from foreign countries. Because just simple examples, usually companies from abroad, usually they are well prepared in many cases. So they expect the same from the Brazilian market and from the Brazilian partner. And if it's usually a Brazilian partner, usually they are not used to this kind of preparation. So then often they say they're having this structure usually internally to say that. And I would also add some, let's say, additional budget for any surprises that could appear, but it will appear. You could have the best partner, but there are some steps you really don't know what's going to happen, because it's not in the hand of any partner. It's some, let's say, if you look at every step that is required to open your company here or to sell your product on the market, there are so many steps. In every one that can, let's say, appear any surprises. And I would say, not for many countries it's true, but for Brazil it's true. Murphy's Law is really valid here. So everything what can happen will happen in Brazil. So it's from my own experience, it's you think you know all the surprises. No, you don't know. Every time there's an extra one you don't know. So it's this you should somehow incorporate in your budget. Yes.
Good. So guys, we are finishing our talk, and then would you like to make your final remarks? Can you finalize?
Just to wrap up, I'd say this event is a good example of the opportunities we can have in Brazil. I mean, we have plenty of international brands, a lot of national brands also. One thing that we didn't mention in the beginning, why having an interest in Brazil, we're talking about the health sector. There's one element which is really important, which is that Brazil is depending on imports for 60 to 70% of its needs in the medical sector. So this is really important. You don't have so many sectors in Brazil. Maybe you are a food producer or you are manufacturing cars. In some cases, you don't have so many opportunities. In Brazil, the proper functioning of the Brazilian health sector, of providing health to Brazilians, depend on imports, 60 to 70%. So which means Brazil has a local industry. There are some interesting companies in Brazil manufacturing products which are internationalizing. But in general, Brazil is really dependent on imports, which means that there are a lot of opportunities for international manufacturers and suppliers of either equipment or consumables. And this is what makes Brazil really interesting. Again, with the size of the market. Now, in the end, it all comes to people. Brazil is a very large country, everybody knows. It's also a regional market. You will rarely find a partner, a distributor in Brazil, which will be good enough to cover the whole of the country. So there is a really strategic element for getting into Brazil. São Paulo is the largest city and urbanization in Brazil, so a lot of companies tend to think of Brazil as São Paulo very often, but the São Paulo market, either the capital city or the state, is really competitive because everybody comes to São Paulo. The city of São Paulo is the GDP of Chile. The state of São Paulo is the equivalent of Argentina, so it's huge, and people tend to want to come to Brazil initially through São Paulo. Maybe it's interesting in some cases to have some alternative strategies, get into some regions. Brazil is big, so any state of Brazil you take, you will find a European equivalent. So you can have a Portugal in Brazil, you can have a Swiss in Brazil, you can have a Belgium in Brazil, or France, whatever. So it's very important to go gradually to increase your presence in Brazil, and obviously the quality of the distributor you will find will be essential to the success of the project.
Good. Mike, can you leave your final words?
Yeah. So after everything what we heard today, so I think, of course, definitely Brazil is worth to go to Brazil, to open your companies here or sell your products in Brazil. But of course, what we learned today is that it depends on different factors you need to consider. I think if all of them you consider, of course, the main things, what I said, budget issues, let's say partnering, find good partners here in this market. And if you really do your homework, then Brazil is really worth the experiment, let's say that, and you can make good business in Brazil. That's true. So.
Cool. This is it. I would like to say thank you, Bertrand. Thank you, Michael, for that.
Thank you for the invitation.
So, that's okay. We are always available for any questions, and then you can follow us in our website, for example, or in social media. We can contact us. Thank you, everyone.